The incinerator, the frozen timeline, and the mother's deed, why every investigator on the D4vd case is saying the same thing tonight. Something was pulled out of D4vd's house that no working musician has any earthly reason to own. And it wasn't a keepsake. It wasn't a prop. It wasn't a piece of art from a music video shoot. According to the private investigator who was granted access to that Hollywood Hills property last October, one of the items catalogued inside D4vd's home is a piece of industrial equipment that, in the city of Los Angeles, is illegal for a private resident to even possess without a specific permit, a machine capable of reaching 1600 degrees of open, sustained, structural heat. That single detail is the reason multiple threads of this investigation just collided into one, and the reason people who have covered this file since the beginning are now saying that D4vd may not be a free man going into 2026. Cast your memory back to the very first strange note in this timeline. For weeks, the online commentary around D4vd's house had circled the same unanswered question: what exactly did investigators walk into? The PI, Steve Fischer, reportedly described the interior as looking more like a farm than a home. That was the phrase. A farm. Not a studio. Not an artist's compound. A farm. And the chatter tightening around this file right now suggests the incinerator is only the first item on a longer list. Because in a house owned by a young pop artist in the Hollywood Hills, a device engineered to reduce organic matter to nothing at 1600 degrees is not decor. It is a question the whole neighborhood has to answer. Here's where the ground shifts. According to voices closer to the file, sources near the LAPD are now saying that Celeste Rivas Hernandez, the 14-year-old girl whose body was pulled from a Tesla registered to D4vd, was not simply left in that vehicle. She was, by the account being circulated, kept frozen for a period of time before ever being placed there. That is the missing hinge in a timeline that has driven investigators crazy for months. Because if Celeste had passed at the start of 2025, there was no clean forensic explanation for why the body was only discovered, by scent, in September of that same year. A frozen state answers the question. A frozen state also, tragically, hollows out what a medical examiner can determine about a cause. That is the outcome the file is now openly discussing, and it is the outcome that has investigators watching every angle of the property where the incinerator sat. Now stay with me, because the second name in this investigation is the one nobody expected. According to reports that surfaced in the last few weeks, LAPD detectives believe there is a second suspect in the Celeste case, someone who moved in D4vd's inner orbit in the second half of 2024, and someone whose presence on D4vd's private, secondary Instagram account was not subtle. That person, according to the ongoing coverage, is a man referred to as Neo. And once you know his name, the July 21st party photographs read differently. The recreated Titanic-pose reads differently. The Instagram photos of the two of them lying side by side read differently. And the fact that Neo, in the aftermath of all of this, reportedly unfollowed D4vd and scrubbed old photos of him from his own social media reads like a man performing a public disassociation on a very specific timeline. By one account circulating within case-adjacent circles, Neo may have been the last person to drive that black Tesla before it changed hands. That claim has not been confirmed, but the theory now openly floated online is that if D4vd had begun a new relationship in that same window, one built out of the wreckage of whatever he had with Celeste, then the exposure risk represented by Celeste was, in the narrative that investigators are said to be examining, a motive. That is the theory. It is not yet a charge. But every step of the timeline that follows this point in the file reinforces why so many voices are now saying the arrest window is narrowing. The layer stacked beneath that is the media beat, and it is the beat that made even neutral observers lean forward. When TMZ ran their initial framing of the case, one that described Celeste as preserved inside the Tesla in a way that would allegedly make cause of death impossible to determine, the online forensic community pushed back hard. The pushback was simple. A preserved body is not a problem for a medical examiner. A preserved body is a gift to a medical examiner. So why publish a framing that inverts the science? Some commentators pointed to the reported friendship between TMZ founder Harvey Levin and D4vd's attorney, Blair Berk, a connection that, to be clear, has not been formally established as influencing the coverage, but that once entered into public discussion never quite left it. And when LAPD later released a statement that appeared to contradict the initial framing, the question was no longer whether the report was wrong. The question was why the wrong report had traveled so far so fast, and who benefited from the confusion it seeded. What tips the scale further is the swatting incident. On a random day, in the middle of this file, someone called 911 with a fabricated emergency at D4vd's known residence. The officers, professionally, identified it as a swatting attempt almost immediately. But the reason it registered in the case commentary is timing. Out of every property in Los Angeles, out of every day of the year, the address that gets swatted is this one. And in a case where a national audience is already watching the front door, a fake call to a real address starts to feel less like a prank and more like a probe, someone testing to see whether that door still opens, whether the man behind it is still there, whether the file is closer to conclusion than the public is being told. Fischer, the private investigator, has been drip-feeding additional context in a way that has become one of the most closely watched sources of this file. According to what he has shared, D4vd and Celeste were together in downtown Los Angeles on the night of December 30th into the morning of December 31st, 2024. Photographs from that night exist. Public photographs. The kind of documentation that anchors a timeline. But federal investigators, reportedly working from D4vd's own electronic devices, also recovered a series of images that never surfaced publicly, images of a large group of people gathered in a forest at night. The narrative around those photographs claims they were shot for a music video. The narrative circling investigators is different. Because among those recovered files was a single frame of a small shed in a remote area, photographed at night, and that shed has become one of the quietly discussed pressure points of this investigation. The theory holding among case watchers is that the shed may be tied, directly or indirectly, to the location where Celeste was actually kept during the missing months of this timeline. D4vd, by the account of people who have followed the case closely, is not currently cooperating. His management, in the reporting that has surfaced, may not even know where he is presently living. His attorney knows. His parents know. And beyond that circle, the tracking of D4vd's whereabouts has become one of the most persistent open questions of the entire file. A young artist who once told an interviewer that his 5-year plan was to disappear from the grid, live on an island, delete his digital footprint, and, in his own words, be gone. That interview, at the time, sounded like an eccentric daydream. Watched now, in the context of a homicide investigation that has closed distance around him, it plays as something else entirely. There is a detail buried inside the private investigator's description of the house that has been sitting in the middle of the online conversation without ever getting the weight it deserves. Fischer described the interior as containing items you would expect to find on a farm. That phrasing was not a throwaway. On a working farm, the equipment inventory typically includes industrial containers, industrial cleaning agents, industrial-grade cutting tools, and yes, the kind of high-temperature disposal machinery that has no place in a residential Hollywood Hills property. The permit issue around the incinerator is the surface issue. The deeper issue is that a farm-style equipment inventory does not appear in a home by accident. Someone assembled it. Someone stored it. And someone chose to keep it inside a property owned by a young musician in a residential neighborhood, in a city where every one of those items carries its own separate legal footprint. Case watchers walking through the reporting have begun to describe the inventory less as a collection and more as a system, a set of tools whose purpose, when placed next to a frozen body and a Tesla and a disappearance, aligns in a direction nobody following this file wants to look at directly. That is the reason the incinerator has traveled so far in the coverage. Not because a single machine is damning on its own. Because a single machine inside a matching inventory is the outline of a purpose. The layer that changed the conversation in the last few weeks, the one that made even the most cautious analyst stop hedging, is the deed. On the same day Celeste's body was recovered from D4vd's Tesla, D4vd reportedly transferred ownership of his home into his mother's name. Not a week later. Not a month later. The same day. Property law across the United States is unusually consistent on this point. When assets are transferred in the immediate aftermath of an event that could trigger civil or criminal exposure, courts have well-established authority, under statutes commonly grouped under fraudulent transfer or fraudulent conveyance doctrines, to pierce those transfers and treat the asset as if it had never left the original owner. Legal analysts who have looked at the timing describe the transaction as, at minimum, a puzzling coincidence. Others have described it more directly as consciousness of exposure. The narrative around the case has stopped treating it as a neutral event. Meanwhile, the images being pulled from D4vd's own past have started to arrange themselves into a pattern that is difficult to ignore. A photograph surfaced, reportedly taken at an anime convention, in which D4vd is wearing a wig strikingly similar in style to one Celeste was known to wear. Online users compared the two images side by side and reached the same conclusion in comment sections everywhere. D4vd has spoken publicly about how his music videos are inspired by an anime storyline he built himself, a storyline whose main character, in his own on-camera description, is an alter ego. Not a hero. An agent of chaos. A version of himself who commits crimes that another version of himself, playing detective, is then tasked with solving. He described the parallel to Fight Club. He described the parallel to Tyler Durden. He described it, on camera, in an interview that circulated for years without anyone treating it as anything more than a musician's creative flourish. That interview does not read the same way anymore. One commenter's line, that there are hundreds of examples he could have used to describe an alter ego, and he chose that one, has become one of the most repeated observations of the entire online conversation around this file. Reconstruct the timeline for a moment, because when you set the reporting on a single line, the shape of the file becomes almost unbearable to look at. In the final days of 2024, D4vd and Celeste are photographed together in downtown Los Angeles. Within weeks of that appearance, the reporting suggests, Celeste is no longer with him, no longer visible in his life, no longer surfacing on any of the platforms she had used before, no longer answering the people who had known her. By February of 2025, D4vd records a video from inside a private rental property, and the picture frame visible in the background is later matched by investigators to a second rental residence, a residence that, by one narrative circulating in the case, is the same property where Celeste had reportedly been living. That same February, D4vd leases a red Tesla and stops using his black one. The car swap by itself would be unremarkable, musicians rotate vehicles constantly. Placed inside a timeline that already has a missing young woman inside it, the swap becomes a data point. Investigators reportedly viewed portions of the February video, particularly the muted moments in which D4vd is heard to remark that he wished people would stop passing away, as material worth pulling into the file. He may have been speaking about the year in general. He may have been speaking about a specific loss. The ambiguity is precisely what makes the clip evidence, in the loose sense of the word, not proof of intent, but proof of a state of mind worth documenting. And when you place that February footage next to the September moment the Tesla is opened and Celeste is found, the months between those two dates become the loudest silence in the entire case. Every element of D4vd's public trail is being re-examined now. A June 27, 2024 concert clip surfaced in which Celeste appears backstage alongside D4vd's brother. In that footage, if it is accurate and correctly dated, Celeste is wearing Hello Kitty sandals, the exact detail her family used when they filed her missing persons report. If the footage stands, it places Celeste inside D4vd's touring orbit within weeks of her family reporting her missing. A January 11, 2024 live stream resurfaced in which Celeste appears to be present with D4vd in real time, and in which D4vd reportedly instructs his moderators to delete the recording and all associated clips the moment the stream ends. That request, on its own, is not proof of anything. Placed inside the broader timeline, it becomes another line item in a document that grows heavier every week. An individual who says he previously collaborated with D4vd on music has stepped forward to add another layer. According to his account, there were concerns raised as early as 2023, concerns unrelated to Celeste, involving different young women who had reportedly reached out with allegations about D4vd's private conduct. This collaborator says that when he attempted to raise those concerns publicly, D4vd's legal team moved to have material removed, songs pulled from streaming platforms, and the conversation shut down under the framing of misinformation. He has produced what he describes as an email from that legal team to substantiate the account. Those allegations have not been independently verified. But their placement inside the current timeline is the reason they are being taken seriously now in a way they were not 2 years ago. The story then turned to an arcade. A Twitch streamer reportedly recognized D4vd inside that arcade in the company of a young woman whom viewers, watching the clip live, initially believed to be the missing Celeste. It was later clarified that she was not the missing person, but she was also, in a coincidence that has never stopped being discussed, named Celeste. She wore glasses. She wore a Gap sweater that some observers compared to one referenced on the missing persons poster. The online reading of that footage, a reading that remains speculation and not established fact, is that a substitution was being staged in public, an attempt to muddy the identification. Whether that reading is accurate or not, the reason it caught fire is that it fits the pattern the rest of this file has been building. And while investigators reportedly move toward a grand jury presentation, D4vd's most consistent online footprint in the last several months has been, of all things, a gaming account. Observers of a certain Fortnite handle tied to him say the account has continued to show recent activity, some claiming logins as recent as within the same hour they were checking. The reaction online has been near universal. If this is genuinely him, spending his evenings inside a video game while the mother of the girl found in his Tesla is still waiting for a full answer, then the optics are not what a defense strategy would recommend. If it is not him, then someone with access to his credentials is generating a public breadcrumb trail that only deepens the public frustration. D4vd's parents' home was also visited by police during the case, not, according to the reporting that followed, as part of the active investigation itself, but as a response to what appears to have been another false emergency call. Filing that kind of call is a serious offense on its own. And the speculation that emerged from that incident, that someone was attempting to locate D4vd by triggering a police response at an address associated with his family, has fueled its own separate wave of online commentary. Because at the center of every single one of these threads is the same absence. The missing address. The missing statement. The missing man. Even Celeste's brother has now spoken publicly, and the sentence that traveled the furthest was the plainest. He said he did not know anything until the last time his sister left. He said Celeste did nothing but love him. He said he was one of the only people she loved. And he asked the online public, directly, why they were building stories that made him look complicit in something he had no knowledge of. That statement is the human weight in a file that has otherwise become a spreadsheet of timelines, transactions, and recovered images. It is the reminder that the 14-year-old at the center of this case was somebody's little sister, and that the noise of the investigation cannot be allowed to bury her name. When the dust settles on this timeline, the incinerator inside a Hollywood Hills home, the frozen months in a case that should have had a clean forensic answer, the second suspect named Neo, the recreated Titanic-pose, the deed transferred to a mother on the same day a body was pulled from a Tesla, the wig at the anime convention, the alter ego confession that now reads like a coded thesis statement, the deleted live stream, the arcade Celeste, the Fortnite lurker, the swatted address, the missing man, what emerges is not one open question. It is a stack of them. And the reason the online case tracking community keeps circling back to this file is that every new week of reporting closes one loop and opens two more. D4vd has not been arrested. He has not been charged. The reporting that suggests an arrest is being discussed for early 2026 remains reporting, not adjudication, and the presumption of innocence is not a courtesy, it is a legal standard the case will have to clear at every stage. But the presumption of innocence is not a gag order on public curiosity, and the public curiosity around this case is not going anywhere. Not with a 1600-degree machine sitting in the middle of the evidence log. Not with a 14-year-old girl whose family is still asking what happened during the months between her disappearance and the Tesla. And not with a timeline this crowded, this documented, and this quietly damning. One final layer worth naming before you decide where you land on this file. The case around D4vd is unfolding at the intersection of three separate audiences, the professional investigators building a legal case, the independent private investigator releasing information in public increments, and an enormous online community reconstructing every screenshot, every backstage clip, every music video frame in real time. Every one of those audiences is operating on a different timeline, with different standards of evidence, and different stakes. What they share, at this point, is the same shortening list of open questions and the same growing conviction that this case is not going to end quietly. Drop your read of this timeline below. Which detail, the incinerator, the frozen months, the deed to the mother, the wig, or the alter ego confession, is the one you can't stop thinking about? And if you want the next update in this file the moment it lands, subscribe now, because the next development is closer than most of the coverage is admitting.